The grand chandelier in the ballroom glittered like a constellation, each crystal prism scattering light over the polished marble floor. Laughter and clinking glasses echoed around the room, the hum of celebration masking the tension coiling inside me. My sister, radiant in a gown that seemed woven from sunlight itself, floated through the crowd, waving and smiling. I forced a smile as I followed, feeling like an intruder in a fairy tale that had always belonged to her. It wasn't the first time I'd felt invisible around my family, but somehow, weddings amplified the sting. Everyone's eyes were on her, the perfect daughter, the perfect bride, and there I was, standing on the periphery, a silent spectator in my own life. My mother, seated at the head table, glanced at me briefly, and in that brief look, I felt the old familiar weight of judgment. "Ah, there you are," she said finally, her voice dripping with casual sweetness. "Come, let everyone see you." Her eyes scanned me with a cold precision that made my stomach twist. I smiled politely, but she wasn't done. Leaning slightly closer, so no one else could hear, she murmured, "You're like a scratched label. Visible, yes, but worn out, forgotten, and flawed." The words sank into me like shards of glass. A scratched label. I'd heard her sarcasm before, her backhanded compliments, but this was different. Public enough that I could almost see the shock ripple across my sister's new husband's face, subtle enough that most guests wouldn't notice. But I noticed, every fiber of me did. I wanted to turn and leave, to vanish into the shadows where my mother's words could not reach me. Instead, I clenched my jaw and walked past her, letting the polite smile mask the fury burning inside. I could feel my son's small hand squeeze mine, 12 years old, yet he already had the keen perception of a hawk. He had felt it too, and though he said nothing, his eyes asked the same question my own heart had been asking for years. Why does she hurt me? The reception swirled around me. Waiters offered champagne, the band's melody floated through the air, and my sister's friends danced like butterflies. Yet I felt stranded, marooned on an island of humiliation. I remembered every birthday when my accomplishments were shrugged off, every holiday when my ideas were dismissed, every whispered remark that made me question my worth. The wedding, meant to celebrate joy, had become a gallery of old scars. I tried to focus on my son, who had been fidgeting with the edge of his napkin, pretending to be absorbed in coloring, yet clearly watching my mother like a hawk. He had a quiet courage that I had nurtured fiercely, and in that moment, I realized that I wasn't alone in feeling the sting. There was someone on my side, even if he didn't fully understand why my mother's words hurt. He felt the injustice intuitively. As the speeches began, I stayed at the edge of the room, nursing a glass of sparkling water I didn't drink. My mother's eyes flicked toward me repeatedly, a predator watching prey, delighting in discomfort. Each glance was a reminder of all the years I had spent trying to earn her approval, the countless times I had measured my worth against her impossible standards. I had learned to survive her barbs, to shrug them off with a smile, but tonight the wound felt raw again, opened in front of an audience that didn't know the full story. I caught a glimpse of my sister, beaming beside her new husband, unaware of the quiet storm brewing beside her. And for a fleeting moment, I let myself imagine the satisfaction of standing tall, not as the overlooked sibling, not as the scratched label, but as someone who had endured and survived, someone whose strength wasn't measured by her mother's cruel words. The thought ignited a tiny spark of determination. Tonight, I told myself, was only the beginning. After the toasts, I slipped away to the quiet corner of the terrace, the warm glow of string lights casting a soft halo over the night. The music and laughter drifted behind me, a pleasant backdrop that felt impossibly distant. My mind, however, refused to stay in the present. Instead, it spiraled back through years of memories, each one a shard of the same relentless pattern. My mother's subtle cruelty, her dismissive glances, the whispered judgments that followed me like shadows. I remembered my 10th birthday. My sister had received a beautiful dollhouse, a miniature palace, complete with chandeliers that actually lit up. My gift, a carefully chosen book of illustrations, was met with a sniff of disapproval. "You always pick things that are odd." My mother said, and my heart had crumpled then, though I had forced a polite "thank you" through the sting of humiliation. That was the first time I learned to smile through the ache, to hide the wound beneath a practiced mask. High school brought no relief. I worked tirelessly on my science projects, staying up late into the night, meticulously recording experiments and results. On the day of the science fair, my mother barely glanced at my display, instead asking my sister about her latest fashion sketches. "Your sister's project is more exciting," she had said, as if my months of work were invisible. I had nodded, biting back tears, learning to swallow disappointment early and often. Even now, I could recall the sharpest moments of my adult life, the weddings I attended, the promotions celebrated, the achievements quietly tucked away. My mother's barbed comments, always casual, always precise, were like tiny injections of poison that spread slowly, leaving doubts where confidence should grow. And yet, in spite of it all, I had survived. I had built a life that didn't revolve around her approval, cultivated a career, nurtured a loving home, and raised a son who had already begun to understand the difference between cruelty and kindness. He had inherited my sensitivity, yes, but also a resilience I recognized all too well. As I watched him earlier at the reception, quietly observing my mother, I realized he understood something I hadn't expected. He could see injustice even at 12, even when it was delivered with 8. Smile, that awareness filled me with a bittersweet pride. I had survived my mother's words for decades, and now my son, my small warrior, was quietly learning the same lessons. But with the advantage of courage I had only dreamed of possessing at his age. I thought about the quiet evenings we spent together, reading, talking, and laughing in our own world, a sanctuary from the subtle cruelty outside. I had raised him to speak truth, to stand up for himself, to feel deeply, but not allow the world to dictate his worth. And now, at this wedding, my sister's wedding, my mother's stage, I sensed a turning point, a moment waiting to be seized. I could feel the old fear creeping back, the familiar urge to shrink, to hide, to pretend the words didn't sting. But I also felt a new, steadier flame, the knowledge that humiliation loses power when confronted with dignity and support. And I had that support. Not from my mother, not even from my sister, but from the boy who held my hand and mirrored my heartbeat with quiet intensity. Tonight, the past and present collided. Each memory of pain sharpened my resolve, reminding me that I was no longer a passive observer. I was a mother, a protector, and a witness to my own survival, and I knew, with an instinctual certainty, that the next moments would demand more than just endurance. They would demand courage. I glanced back toward the ballroom. My mother was laughing with a distant cousin, unaware, or perhaps carelessly aware, of the storm gathering silently in the next generation. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself a small, private smile, one born of defiance and hope. The stage was set. My son would speak when the time came, and when he did, nothing could undo the truth he carried. Tonight, the scratched label would not remain hidden. The music had softened to a slow, melodic waltz, couples swaying across the dance floor in gentle rhythm. I stayed near the edges, my fingers wrapped tightly around my son's hand. 12 years old, yet his grip felt steady, confident, a grounding force amid the storm of emotions swirling inside me. For hours, I had endured my mother's pointed glances and subtle digs, each one a tiny echo of decades, old wounds. But now something in the air shifted, a quiet anticipation I could feel radiating from him. It began with a whisper, barely audible above the hum of conversation. "Mom," his voice was soft but firm, drawing my attention immediately. My heart skipped. I glanced down at him, and he met my eyes with a seriousness that made my chest tighten. "You know," he said, his tone deliberate, "sometimes people say things they shouldn't, things that hurt others even when they don't think it matters." His gaze slid toward my mother, who was mid-laugh at a cousin's joke. The amusement on her face faltered slightly, just enough to make her look up. She began, but he held up a small hand, stopping her before she could deflect. "You called my mom a scratched label tonight," he continued, voice rising slightly, but still calm and measured. "You said it as if she was worthless, like she didn't matter. But that's not true. She works so hard every day to be a good mom, and you should know better than to hurt her like that." A hush fell over the nearby tables. Guests had started noticing, whispering, turning toward the confrontation. My mother's expression flickered between surprise and indignation, her lips pressed into a thin line, a shield against the unexpected exposure. Words can wound, he went on, but they can also show who we really are, and right now, everyone can see it. He paused, searching for the right words. How unfair you've been, not just tonight, but for years, and it's not okay. I felt tears prick my eyes. Not of shame, but of a swelling pride so powerful, it nearly knocked the wind from me. This was my son, standing tall in a room full of adults, wielding nothing but truth and courage, exposing the pain that had been ignored for far too long. My mother opened her mouth again, trying to respond, but the words faltered. The tables had turned. Where she had intended ridicule, she now faced clarity. Where she had sought to belittle, she now encountered strength, innocence, and justice, bundled into one small voice. "You're brave," I whispered to him, pressing my hand to his shoulder. He glanced at me, eyes wide but unwavering, and I saw the reflection of my own resilience in his face. This was not rebellion nor disrespect. It was the quiet, piercing truth of someone who knew right from wrong and refused to be silent. The guests murmured among themselves. Some shook their heads in surprise, others smiled quietly, approvingly. My sister, the bride, looked stunned, as if seeing her mother in a new light for the first time. And amidst it all, my mother's usual armor of composure cracked, just enough for me to glimpse the flicker of recognition, perhaps even shame behind her eyes. My son's final words were deliberate, echoing in the space between them. "You can't keep hurting people and expect no one to notice. My mom is strong, and she deserves respect. She always has." The room remained silent for a heartbeat longer. Then the band resumed the music, softer now, subdued by the weight of what had just been said. My mother sat back, stiff and unreadable, her victory vanishing into thin air. I exhaled, a long, trembling release of tension. Pride and relief flooded me, mingled with an almost dizzying sense of vindication. My son had done what I could not do, not because I lacked courage, but because I lacked the innocence to speak without fear of repercussion. In that moment, standing on the edge of the dance floor, holding my son's hand, I realized that the power of words is not in their cruelty, but in their truth. Tonight, the truth had spoken through him, piercing deeper than any insult ever could. And I knew with quiet certainty that this was only the beginning of reclaiming what had been lost. The music had resumed, but the atmosphere felt irrevocably altered. Where there had once been laughter at casual jokes, there was now a quiet respect, or perhaps a wary caution, lingering in the air. I stayed close to my son, feeling the warmth of his hand in mine, a tether to courage and truth. The crowd had shifted subtly. Whispers of admiration and surprise rippled among the guests, acknowledging what had just happened. My mother, usually poised and untouchable, now sat rigid, her eyes flicking away from mine. For the first time, the power she had wielded so easily was gone, dissipated by the piercing clarity of my son's words. I felt a mixture of relief, pride, and an almost dizzying sense of liberation. All those years of feeling like a scratched label, all the silent humiliations and subtle cruelties, had built a quiet storm inside me, and now I realized that storm had found its voice, not mine but my son's, and it had struck with precision. There was no gloating in his words, only truth, and truth, I knew, was far more devastating than any anger I could have unleashed myself. My sister approached, her wedding glow softened by concern. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice low, almost hesitant. I nodded, letting a small, weary smile touch my lips. "I am now," I said, "more than okay." She studied me for a moment, then offered a small, genuine smile of her own, as if seeing me for who I truly was for the first time. Around us, conversations resumed, lighter now, but with a newfound respect threaded through them. Guests who had never spoken to me now looked at me differently, some with admiration, some with quiet acknowledgement. And my son, he looked at me with wide eyes, his small chest still rising with the effort of bravery, but his face glowing with pride. I pulled him close, pressing my cheek to his. You were incredible, I whispered. You stood up for me and for yourself and for what's right. I'm so proud of you. He beamed, a shy smile breaking through the intensity of his courage. I just said what needed to be said, he murmured. But I knew it was more than that. It was the culmination of years of love, teaching him to value truth over fear, to see injustice and not turn away. He had learned from me, and in doing so, had become a stronger, braver version of himself. My mother, meanwhile, remained quiet. Her carefully maintained mask of superiority had slipped, revealing a vulnerability I had rarely seen. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and for the first time, I realized that her cruelty had consequences beyond the fleeting satisfaction she thought it brought. I felt no glee at her discomfort, only the quiet satisfaction that her words no longer held power over me, and that her attempts to wound would no longer succeed. As the evening drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The years of whispered judgments, the silent rejections, the nights of tears and self-doubt, they had shaped me, yes, but they had also forged my resilience. And now, watching my son, I understood something profound. Revenge does not need to be bitter. Sweet revenge lies in surviving, in teaching the next generation to stand tall, and in reclaiming your dignity without losing your heart. Later, outside under the star-strewn sky, I held my son close and watched guests depart, their laughter and chatter fading into the night. We did it, he said softly, leaning against me. I nodded, squeezing him gently. Yes, I whispered. We did it together, and in that moment I felt the last of the old wounds soften. The scratched label was no more, not because my mother had changed, but because I had. I had found strength, dignity, and love that no cruel words could erase. My son had shown the way, and together we had reclaimed what had always been ours: respect, courage, and the quiet triumph of truth. The wedding, once a stage for humiliation, had become a testament to endurance, love, and justice. And as we walked away, side by side, I knew the sweetest revenge of all was living fully, proudly, and unashamedly, while leaving those who sought to wound behind in the shadows of their own choices.